Don't worry, sweetheart. Once the old man has his little accident up in those mountains, we'll be set for life. A slip on the hiking trail, a fall down the ravine. Who's going to question it? He's 67 years old with a bad knee. These things happen all the time. Those words stopped me cold in the hallway of my own home. I had come back for my heart medication, the little blue pills I'd forgotten on the kitchen counter. But what I found instead was my son, Kevin, sitting in my living room, plotting my murder with his wife, Rachel, like they were discussing weekend plans. My name is Harold. I'm 67 years old, and the day my son gave me a 2-week vacation at a mountain cabin in Colorado, I should have known something was terribly wrong. Kevin hadn't shown me genuine affection in years. But standing there behind that door, listening to him describe my death as a business transaction, something inside me shifted. The life insurance alone is $400,000, Kevin continued, his voice cold and calculating. Plus the house, the savings, the pension, we're looking at close to $1 million total, enough to pay off everything and start fresh. And you're sure the cabin is isolated enough? Rachel asked. I could hear the greed dripping from every word. Absolutely. It's in the middle of nowhere. Cell service is spotty at best. By the time anyone finds him, we'll already be the grieving family collecting condolences. I pressed my back against the wall, feeling like the floor had turned to quicksand beneath my feet. This was my son, the boy I had taught to ride a bike, the young man I had put through college, the person I had sacrificed everything for after his mother died of breast cancer 15 years ago. And now he wanted me dead. For a moment, I considered confronting him right there, bursting through that door and demanding to know how he could even think such a thing. But 67 years of life had taught me something important. When you're outnumbered and outmatched, you don't fight head-on. You get smart, you get strategic. You make them regret ever underestimating you. So I did something that surprised even myself. I smiled. Because if my son thought his father was just a frail old man waiting to be pushed off a mountain, he was about to learn the most painful lesson of his life. I slipped out of the house silently. My heart medication forgotten. There would be time for that later. Right now, I needed to think. I needed to plan. And most importantly, I needed to survive. The drive to Colorado was supposed to take about 8 hours. Kevin had arranged everything himself, insisting that I take his SUV because it was more comfortable for long trips. "You deserve this, Dad," he had said, with that fake smile plastered across his face. "You've worked so hard your whole life. It's time to relax and enjoy nature." What he really meant was that it was time for me to die in nature. As I drove through Kansas, watching the endless wheat fields stretch toward the horizon, I couldn't stop replaying the last few years in my mind. When had my son become this person? When had the little boy who used to hold my hand crossing the street transformed into someone capable of murder? The signs had been there, I realized. I just hadn't wanted to see them. It started about 3 years ago when Kevin married Rachel. She came from money, or at least she acted like she did. Designer clothes, expensive taste, always talking about the lifestyle she deserved. Kevin changed after meeting her. He became obsessed with appearances, with status, with keeping up with people who had far more than we ever did. Then came the business venture. Kevin convinced me to co-sign a loan for his startup tech company, $200,000. He promised it was a sure thing, that he'd pay me back within 2 years. But the company failed within 8 months, and suddenly I was on the hook for a debt that wasn't mine. I never blamed him publicly. I quietly refinanced my house, dipped into my retirement savings, did what fathers do. I protected my son from the consequences of his mistakes. But apparently, that wasn't enough. Apparently, the only thing left for Kevin to take from me was my life itself. I arrived at the mountain cabin late in the afternoon. It was beautiful, I had to admit. A rustic 2-story wooden structure nestled among tall pines, with a wraparound porch and a view of the Rocky Mountains that would have taken my breath away under different circumstances. But I wasn't here to admire the scenery. I was here to survive. The first thing I did was survey the property. The cabin sat on about 5 acres of forested land, with a hiking trail leading up into the mountains behind it. The nearest neighbor was about a 1/4 mile away, close enough to potentially provide help, but far enough that screams might go unheard. Kevin had chosen well. This was indeed the perfect place for an accident. I unpacked my bags slowly, my mind racing with possibilities. I needed information. I needed to understand exactly what Kevin was planning and when he intended to execute it. Most importantly, I needed allies. That evening, as I sat on the porch watching the sun set behind the mountains, I noticed movement at the neighboring cabin. An older gentleman, perhaps a few years younger than me, was chopping firewood with the efficiency of someone who'd done it thousands of times before. Something about his posture caught my attention. It was the stance of a man who knew how to handle himself, who had faced difficult situations and come out stronger on the other side. I decided to introduce myself. "Beautiful evening," I called out, walking toward the property line. The man looked up and smiled, wiping sweat from his forehead. He had silver hair cut short, sharp blue eyes, and the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades outdoors. "Sure is," he replied, setting down his axe. "You must be the new neighbor. I'm George Patterson, Harold Mitchell." "Nice to meet you, George." We shook hands, and I felt an immediate connection. There was something trustworthy about this man, something solid and reliable that reminded me of the friends I'd made during my years as a construction engineer. "First time in Colorado?" George asked. "First time at this cabin, anyway. My son arranged the whole thing as a gift." "That's thoughtful of him. Family's important." Something in my expression must have changed, because George's eyes narrowed slightly. "You okay, Harold? You look like a man with something heavy on his mind." I hesitated. Every instinct told me to keep my problems to myself, to not burden a stranger with my nightmare. But there was something about George that made me feel I could trust him. And right now, I desperately needed someone to trust. "George, can I ask you something personal?" "Shoot." "Have you ever discovered that someone you loved completely had betrayed you in the worst possible way?" George was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "My partner," he said. 30 years on the force together. Turned out he was taking bribes from drug dealers the whole time. When I found out, it nearly destroyed me. "You were a police officer?" "FBI. Retired 5 years ago after 32 years of service." My heart nearly stopped. Of all the neighbors I could have had, fate had placed me next to a retired FBI agent. "George," I said, lowering my voice, "I need to tell you something. Something that's going to sound completely insane, but I swear to you, every word is true." For the next hour, I told George everything. The overheard conversation, Kevin's debts, the insurance policy, the isolation of the cabin. He listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker with every detail. When I finished, George was silent for a full minute. "Harold," he finally said, "I've worked homicide cases for 2 decades. I've seen what greed does to people, even family members. What you're describing isn't insane. It's textbook. Isolation, opportunity, financial motive. Your son has planned this carefully. So you believe me?" "I believe you, and more importantly, I'm going to help you. But we need to be smart about this. We need evidence, documentation, witnesses. We need to build a case that no prosecutor can dismiss." That night, lying in the unfamiliar bed of the cabin, I felt something I hadn't felt in days. Hope. I wasn't alone anymore. I had an ally, someone with the skills and experience to help me navigate this nightmare. But I also knew that Kevin wouldn't wait forever. Somewhere out there, a clock was ticking toward my intended death. The next morning, George came over with coffee and a plan. "First things first," he said, spreading a map of the area across my kitchen table. "We need to identify the most likely locations for an accident. If Kevin hired someone to do this, that person is probably already in the area, watching you, learning your routine. You think there's someone else involved?" "Almost certainly. Kevin can't be here himself without raising suspicion. He needs an alibi, which means he needs someone else to do the actual deed." We spent the morning mapping out the hiking trails, noting the most dangerous spots, the areas with steep drops and loose rocks. George pointed out 3 locations that would be perfect for staging a fatal fall. "These are your danger zones," he explained. Under no circumstances should you go to any of these places alone. Preferably, don't go at all. That afternoon, I received my first phone call from Kevin. "Dad, how's the cabin? Are you settling in okay?" His voice sounded so normal, so concerned. If I hadn't heard him planning my murder, I would have believed every word. "It's beautiful, son. Thank you so much for this gift." "That's great, Dad. Have you done any hiking yet?" George, who was sitting across from me, held up a notepad. He had written, "He's checking if you've found the trails yet." "Not yet," I replied carefully. "I'm still getting my bearings. Maybe tomorrow." "You should definitely check out the Eagle Peak Trail. I heard it has incredible views. Just be careful near the edges. Those mountain trails can be tricky." George's eyes widened. He wrote, "He just told you where it's going to happen." "I'll be careful, Kevin. I always am." "That's good, Dad. Hey, have you met any of the neighbors? Made any friends?" Another loaded question. Kevin wanted to know if I had allies, if there was anyone who might notice if I disappeared. I glanced at George, who nodded encouragingly. "Actually, yes. There's a very nice gentleman in the cabin next door, George. He's been very helpful showing me around." There was a barely perceptible pause before Kevin responded. "That's great, Dad. It's good that you're making friends. Just remember, you're there to relax. Don't overexert yourself." "I won't, son. I promise." After I hung up, George shook his head slowly. "Harold, that conversation told us a lot. First, Kevin specifically mentioned Eagle Peak. That's likely where the accident is planned. Second, he was clearly uncomfortable when you mentioned having a neighbor. He wants you isolated. What do we do now? Now we set a trap. But first, I need to make some calls to some old colleagues. If your son hired a professional, there might be a paper trail." Over the next 3 days, George and I fell into a routine. We would meet in the mornings to discuss strategy, spend the afternoons gathering information, and have dinner together while analyzing what we'd learned. George's contacts came through faster than expected. A former colleague who now worked in financial crimes pulled Kevin's records and discovered a pattern of gambling debts totaling over $300,000. My son had been hiding a severe gambling addiction for years, losing money at underground poker games and offshore betting sites. But that wasn't the worst of it. "Harold," George said one evening, his face grim, "there's something else you need to know. 3 months ago, Kevin took out an additional life insurance policy on you. $1.2 million. He forged your signature on the application." The betrayal cut deeper with every new revelation. And there's more. The policy has a clause that doubles the payout for accidental death. $2.4 million. That was what my life was worth to my son. On the 4th day, I noticed something that confirmed our suspicions. A man in his 40s, fit and alert, had been appearing in various places around the property. I first saw him at the general store when I went to buy groceries, then again on the road leading to the cabin, and finally, hiking on the trail behind my property. "That's our guy," George said when I described him. "Professional, probably ex-military based on his bearing. He's been watching you, learning your patterns." "What do we do?" "We let him think he's in control. But we're going to feed him false information. Tonight, you're going to take a phone call from Kevin where you mention that you're planning to hike Eagle Peak tomorrow morning, alone, at sunrise. But won't that be dangerous?" George smiled. "You won't actually be there, but our friend will be. And so will I, along with some backup I've arranged." That night, Kevin called exactly on schedule. "Hey, Dad, how are you enjoying the mountains?" "They're incredible, Kevin. In fact, I've decided to finally check out that Eagle Peak trail you mentioned. I'm going to hike it tomorrow at sunrise to catch the morning light." That's great, Dad. Just be careful, okay? Those trails can be slippery in the morning dew. Don't worry about me. I've been hiking my whole life. I know how to handle myself." "I know you do, Dad. I love you." The words felt like acid in my ears. "I love you too, son." After I hung up, George called his contacts. 3 retired law enforcement officers who lived in the area and owed him favors. They would be in position before dawn. I barely slept that night. Every sound made me jump, Every shadow seemed threatening. But alongside the fear, there was something else. Anticipation. Tomorrow, we would finally have proof. At 4 in the morning, George came to collect me. We drove to a position overlooking the Eagle Peak trailhead, where we could observe without being seen. "Remember," George whispered, "no matter what happens, you stay in this vehicle. The doors are locked, and if anything goes wrong, you drive straight to the sheriff's office." The sun was just beginning to lighten the sky when we saw him. The man in his 40s, dressed in hiking gear, carrying a backpack. He moved with purpose, heading up the trail toward the dangerous overlook that Kevin had specifically mentioned. George's radio crackled. "Target is in position. He's setting up near the cliff edge. Looks like he's waiting for someone. Waiting for me. Waiting to push me to my death." For 2 hours, the man waited. As the sun rose higher and it became clear that I wasn't coming, his demeanor changed. He began pacing, checking his phone repeatedly, growing increasingly agitated. Finally, he made a call. George had positioned one of his colleagues close enough to pick up fragments of the conversation with a directional microphone. "He's not here. I don't know. Maybe he changed his mind. No, I haven't been made. I'm telling you, something's wrong." Then came the words that would seal Kevin's fate. "Look, Sullivan, you hired me to do a job. I'm at the exact location your son specified. If the target doesn't show, that's not my problem. I still expect full payment." George looked at me with grim satisfaction. "We got him, Harold. He just connected himself to Kevin directly, and my colleague recorded the whole thing." The man left the trail an hour later, looking frustrated and confused. George's team followed him to a motel 20 miles away, where they documented his license plate, his room number, and his movements. But we weren't done yet. We needed Kevin to incriminate himself directly. That evening, I made the call I'd been dreading. "Kevin, we need to talk." "Dad? What's wrong? You sound strange." "I know, Kevin. I know everything." Silence. The kind of silence that speaks volumes. "What are you talking about, Dad?" "I know about the one-way trip you planned for me. I know about the man you hired. I know about the life insurance policy you forged. I know about your gambling debts." More silence. Then, Kevin's voice changed. The mask fell away completely. "Dad, you don't understand. I was desperate. The people I owe money to, they're dangerous. They were going to hurt Rachel, hurt me. I didn't have a choice." "You had a choice, Kevin. You could have come to me. You could have asked for help. Instead, you chose to murder your own father. It wasn't supposed to be murder. It was going to be quick, painless. You wouldn't have suffered." I felt tears streaming down my face, but my voice remained steady. "Do you hear yourself? You're justifying killing me because it would have been painless? Dad, please. We can work this out. Come home, and we'll figure something out together. I'll pay you back everything, I swear." "It's too late for that, Kevin. I have recordings of all our conversations. I have evidence of the forged insurance documents. I have testimony from the man you hired. When I get back to Chicago, I'm going to the police." "Dad, you can't do that. I'm your son." "You stopped being my son the moment you decided my life was worth less than your gambling debts." "Dad, please, I'm begging you." "Goodbye, Kevin." I hung up the phone and sat in silence for a long time. George was there, a steady presence beside me. "You did the right thing, Harold." "Then why does it feel like my heart is being torn apart?" The next morning, George helped me pack up my things. There was no point in staying at the cabin any longer. The trap had been sprung, the evidence gathered. Now it was time to go home and face the consequences. Before I left, George handed me a thick folder. "Everything's in here," he said. "Recordings, photographs, financial documents, witness statements. Any prosecutor worth their salt will have an airtight case." "George, I don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to thank me, Harold. Men like us, we don't let injustice stand. We fight back. That's who we are." We exchanged phone numbers and promised to stay in touch. As I drove away from the cabin, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw George standing on his porch, watching me go. A stranger who had become a brother. A random neighbor who had saved my life. The drive back to Chicago felt different than the drive out. I was still the same man, but something fundamental had changed inside me. I was no longer the father who sacrificed everything in silence. I was a survivor, a fighter, a man who had stared death in the face and refused to blink. When I arrived home, Detective Morrison from the Chicago Police Department was already waiting for me. George had called ahead, briefing him on the situation and the evidence we had gathered. "Mr. Mitchell," the detective said, shaking my hand, "what you've done is extraordinary. Most victims in your situation never see it coming. The fact that you not only recognized the threat but systematically gathered evidence to prove it shows remarkable presence of mind." "I had help," I said. "I couldn't have done it alone." "Well, the help paid off. Based on the evidence you've provided, we have more than enough to arrest both your son and his wife. We're also working with federal authorities on the insurance fraud charges." That afternoon, Kevin and Rachel were arrested at their home. According to the officers who made the arrest, Kevin broke down completely, crying and begging for mercy. Rachel, on the other hand, remained stone-faced and silent, already calculating her legal defense. The trial took place 8 months later. It was covered by local news stations, the story of a father who had turned the tables on his would-be murderers, capturing public attention. Kevin's lawyer tried to paint him as a desperate man, a victim of gambling addiction who had made terrible choices under extreme pressure. But the evidence was overwhelming. The recordings, the forged documents, the testimony of the hitman Kevin had hired, everything pointed to premeditated attempted murder. In the end, Kevin was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. Rachel received 15 years as a co-conspirator. As they were led away in handcuffs, I felt nothing but emptiness. No satisfaction, no triumph, just the hollow ache of a father who had lost his son long before this trial ever began. A year after the trial, I sold my house in Chicago and moved to Colorado. I bought a small cabin not far from where George lived. We became close friends, spending our days hiking the trails that were supposed to have been my grave. I also started volunteering at a support group for elderly victims of family abuse. My story resonated with so many people, men and women who had been taken advantage of by the very people they loved and trusted most. "Never underestimate yourself," I would tell them. "Never assume that age makes you weak. We have experience, wisdom, and strength that younger people can't even imagine. If someone tries to hurt you, fight back. You're worth fighting for." One evening, George and I sat on my porch, watching the sun set behind the mountains. The same mountains that were supposed to be my final resting place. "Harold," George said, "do you ever regret it, turning Kevin in?" I thought about it for a long moment. "I regret that it was necessary," I finally answered. "I regret that I raised a son who valued money more than his father's life. But do I regret protecting myself? Do I regret fighting back? Not for a single second. And do you think you could ever forgive him?" Forgiveness isn't about the other person, George. It's about freeing yourself from the weight of anger. Maybe someday I'll get there. But right now, I'm focused on something more important. What's that? Living. Really living. For the first time in years. I spent so long sacrificing everything for Kevin that I forgot what it meant to exist for myself. Now I have a second chance, and I'm not going to waste it. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, I reflected on everything that had brought me to this moment. The betrayal, the fear, the determination, the unexpected friendship. It had been the worst experience of my life, and somehow it had also been the making of me. I am Harold Mitchell. I am 68 years old now. And when my son decided that I was worth more dead than alive, he made the worst mistake of his life. Because he didn't kill a helpless old man that day on the mountain. He created something far more dangerous. He created a survivor. Did you like my story? What city are you listening from? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, please support my channel by sending a super thanks so I can continue bringing you more stories like this one. I truly appreciate every one of you. And remember, no matter how old you are, no matter what challenges you face, you always have more strength inside you than you know. Sometimes it takes a crisis to discover it, but once you find it, no one can ever take it away. Until the next story, this is Whispered Vengeance, reminding you that justice may be slow, but it always finds a way.